Chris, welcome home from Bali in the G20.
Oh, thank you.
How's your jet lag?
I mean, look, you can't complain when you get to go on a trip, reporting on the Prime Minister to somewhere on the other side of the world. But I'm jiggered.
Okay. Now, you will have missed, being in a not very Christmassy place, the launch of the Newscast Christmas advert competition.
Oh, I have missed this.
Where we're getting people to suggest things that we could put into the first ever Newscast Christmas advert, which will premiere in December.
Will it?
And we've had some suggestions from Enid in Cambridge and Liz in London, who both suggested a 12 Days of Christmas Newscast mashup. This is what they came up with. 12 wines in a suitcase, 11% inflation, 10 fewer binders, 9 Adams quizzes, 8 guest presenters, 7 Chris's travels, 6 fiscal statements, 5 oozing outros, 4 chancellors, 3 prime ministers, 2 sister podcasts, and a newscast in your pod feed.
Oh, that's really good. As I was listening then, I was thinking, how's this going to end over Partridge in a Pear Tree to get that kind of rhythm? But that is absolute genius, Enid and Liz.
Well, you can now get this podcast in your ears and eyes if you're watching.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Chris, barely capable of working out where I am, but I'm in the studio too.
And it's one of those days where we've got loads of bits of papers and booklets and post-it notes with numbers written on them because we've had the Autumn Statement, which is the sequel to the mini budget. But we've got a new chancellor, a whole new load of policies. Days like this, I think there's kind of like the big picture, and then there's like the 100 things that they announce that make up the big picture. Why don't you do the big picture? So
the big picture is we are less than 8 weeks on from that mini budget that brought down Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, the then Chancellor, and we've had this colossal about turn that would be a colossal about turn if you'd had a general election in between and the party of government had changed. And yet it's one Conservative Chancellor followed by another. And then the other striking thing is that we associate these moments, don't we, with at least in part kind of triumphalism on behalf of the person stood at the dispatch box doing the thing. Some rabbit comes out the hat, something that gets all of their side cheering and the other side thinking, oh, blimey, what do we do in response to that? There was kind of none of that today. It was sombre, it was sober. Even the response from the opposition benches was pretty muted, really, because they know things are really grim for so many people, and any outcome at the next general election will confront the next government, whatever complexion it has, with really difficult decisions and an inheritance of really tough times.
And then you went and had a chat with the Chancellor in a school where it looks like you were sat on very small chairs.
I'm not pretending these aren't going to be difficult times, but there's a plan, there's hope, and if we follow this plan, if we stick with it, we can get through to the other side, make the recession shallower than it might otherwise have been, and give hope to families that we can get back to more normality, more stability. And I think that's what people really want.
In truth, though, you've ducked the difficult decisions, haven't you, until after the next election, when you might be gone?
Well, I've been accused of many things, but ducking difficult decisions.
Postponing some of them.
Well, a Conservative Chancellor standing up in the House of Commons and saying there are going to be £25 billion of tax increases, that is facing up to difficult decisions, but it's facing up to them in a balanced way.
And the Treasury does a handy little list of the 75 things they announced today and how much it costs or raise over the next few years. And the simple
right now, Adam's going to read them all out.
Well, not all of them, just some of them. But the short version is that this year they're going to be spending an extra £64 billion, lots of which is support for people's energy bills and some extra funding for schools and hospitals. But then by 2027, so a few years after the next election, the government is hoping to be raising something like an extra £54 billion. And that will come from increasing people's taxes, but by freezing the rates at which you pay your tax or start paying different levels of tax rather than increasing the rates of tax, and also spending less on government departments and stuff than the government was previously planning to at that point in the future. So that's kind of the basic shape of what's happened today. And let's get some analysis of it with Rachel Reeves, who's the Shadow Chancellor, who's here. Hello.
Hello, great to be here.
Thanks for coming again. I just always wanted to know in these situations, have you written the speech basically in advance and you leave some little like gaps for what the Chancellor has announced? Because you don't have a long time, do you?
You don't have any time and you don't get any advance of the speech or anything like that. Or you do, but the whole thing is redacted. So it says, thank you, Mr. Speaker, I stand here to deliver.
Oh, and you just get like a big black page.
Black. So it's like, well, I'm glad we printed that out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, of course, you have to...
trolling, isn't it? I mean, that really...
It really
then
is.
just black out the interesting bits.
And at the end, it says, I commend a statement to the House. So, of course, you have to write your response in advance. But you've got lots of pages that you can then take out if they don't do something. So I'm working out through, well, have they said something on, non-DOMs, for example? Because we thought they might abolish the non-DOM tax status.
There was some speculation about that.
Yeah, there was. And so we had different versions of what they might say on that. The same with the windfall tax. And we thought they might just match what Labour have done with saying that we would get rid of the investment allowances that enable some of the big energy companies to pay nothing in windfall tax. So you have different versions of bits of it, and you've got to make sure that you take out the right bits. And so this is, I'm not sure if I should be announcing this to Newscast, but we have a little WhatsApp group of me and the Shadow Chief Secretary, Pat McFadden, and 2 people in my office, so that when we're on the front bench for that 50 minutes that the Chancellor spoke, we'll get messages like delete line 167, take out page 12.
Weirdly, that's how we make Newscast as well. That's why me and Chris are looking at our phones rather than you the whole time.
Isn't the truth that quite a lot of what you've spent the last few months arguing for, so a government that is offering a sort of stable picture, increasing all benefits and the state pension in line with inflation, massively increasing the windfall tax, they've done all of that. You're in favour of all of that.
That's not how I felt in the autumn statement today. I definitely felt that they could have shot some of our foxes.
All of those particular points you've argued for, haven't you?
Up to a point. Let's take the windfall tax, for example. They did increase the rate at which it is paid today, and they extended it by another 2 years. But we've said that it should have started in January this year, when those windfalls of war started to be felt. We said that they shouldn't be getting investment allowances for investment that they would have been doing anyway, which cancels the windfall tax for many of them. And the rate should be paid at a slightly higher rate. So there's still billions of pounds there on the table that could be used either for deficit reduction or indeed for helping people with their bills. And we heard today in the autumn statement that from next April, people's gas and electricity bills are likely to be going up by £800 or £900. That's going to be really challenging for people who are already seeing higher food prices, higher mortgage payments, higher rents, higher costs of petrol to get to work, and now budgeting for £800 or £900 extra. So that's why we've said that the government should do more on the windfall tax. And also, and actually this is something today which is so frustrating in the autumn statement, the government said they're going to do more to retrofit homes starting in 2025. But we've got an emergency now with energy bills. But we said over a year ago that you could be retrofitting 2 million homes a year, saving people up to £1,000 off their bills, and there's no time to waste.
When you look at the government sort of projections and what it's planning to do, quite a lot as far as the spending squeeze is concerned seems postponed until the other side of the election, when it's possible you might be the Chancellor. Do you interpret that as something of an attempted political hospital pass, were that to come about and there is a change of government, change of party of
I've never really known
government?
what a hospital pass is, but it doesn't sound very good.
Well,
Let's
it's
put it
meant
that
to,
way.
I think it's a rugby thing, isn't it? And it's a pass that you end up catching,
But you don't really want.
but getting walloped at the same
Yeah, okay,
time. I think
yeah.
that's what it is.
So basically, he's left you having to decide whether you, as Chancellor, would slow
If you
the
were to
growth
win
in
the
public
election.
spending in the same way. Yeah.
Well, I know that because of the mess that the Tories have made of our economy, that Labour's inheritance, if we are to win the next election, is going to be a difficult one. And it does mean that we're not going to be able to do everything that we want to do as quickly as possible. But there are always different choices to be made. And that's the argument that I was trying to get across today. Different choices on tax, for example, on the non-DOMs, on the private equity, on the bank surcharge, etc. But also, beyond that, you've got to have a plan for growth. There's nothing inevitable about where we are in 2 years' time. I was saying to Adam just before we started, this year we've had 3 prime ministers, 4 chancellors and 4 budgets. Who knows, frankly, where we're going to be by the next election.
But it's not going to be rosy, is it? Things aren't going to be rosy.
Not if things carry on like this, but if we had a proper plan for growing our economy. At the moment, the IMF numbers, the International Monetary Fund numbers, show that of the 38 advanced OECD economies, over the next 2 years, we're forecast to have the lowest growth. next year we're forecast to have the lowest growth in the G7 and the highest inflation. Things don't have to be like this. There is a different path that the country could be taking. And so let's see where we are by the next election. But I have set out a set of fiscal rules that, that an incoming Labour government will abide by. I've said there'll be nothing in our manifesto that isn't fully costed and fully funded. But even within those constraints, you could be making different choices on tax that would ease some of the burden on ordinary working people and mean that there was less pressure on the public services that are being cut.
So, well, I was just going to look at a few things that are in the Blue Book, which is the OBR document, which we got this time, which we didn't get last time. And
The
it's so
independent analysers of the numbers.
And it's so funny because the OBR at press conference today, Richard Hughes, who's in charge of it, apologised for it only being 68 pages because normally it's about 200. But anyway, so if
There's
you go,
more available online.
yeah, there's loads of spreadsheets if you really want to see if you want to stay up really late. So if you go to page 40, where they're talking about how much the government is going to be spending on debt interest, so the interest on its debt that it's borrowed in the last few years, it's going to hit about £100 billion a year in kind of 2027ish. When you look at that number, do you think, oh, there's something I can't do because I would be inheriting all that debt interest to pay?
What it says to me is that economic stability and security is just absolutely essential, because when you just mentioned the last fiscal statement, which was the Liz Truss Kwasi Kwarteng kamikaze budget just 2 months ago. And what happened in that mini budget was government borrowing costs went up, and borrowing costs for everybody else, particularly if you've got a mortgage, went up as well. Now, since then, those costs have fallen back a bit, but they've gotten nowhere near back to where they were before. The thing that I really want to do is to try and ensure that people in this country have got opportunities to work. And one of the things that the government announced a review into today was the number of people who have left the workforce. And there's somewhere in this document that shows the number of people who have left the workforce due to sickness. And it is really alarming.
600,000 or something like that?
I think it is about that.
And it's not surprising, because you've got, at the moment, 7 million people waiting for hospital operations. You've got...
No, 5.5 million, because some of those people are waiting for more than one thing.
Well, that's all right then.
No, I'm not saying it's not 7 million people.
Fine. 7 million hospital appointments being waited for. People can't get a GP appointment for love nor money. People are waiting for on the waiting list for mental health treatment. We need to ensure that people can access the labour market. We've had a big increase in the number of people who are economically inactive. Actually, some of that will also include women who are leaving the workforce, often because they're taking on caring responsibilities, either for children or grandchildren, or indeed for elderly parents, because our social care is such a mess. And one of the things I passionately believe in is that to have a strong economy, you've got to have strong public services. You've got to have skills that come from having good schools and good colleges. You've got to have a healthy workforce that comes from having an NHS system that is not on its knees.
And they're putting more money into health and education.
Well, I mean, only to keep up with the rising inflation. You know, today you listen to the Chancellor. Well, let me just say this. Today you listen to the Chancellor and you'd think that we were living in some sort of utopia, the way he described Britain. That is not the experience.
Oh, come on. That's not the impression he was giving, was he? He was pretty sober and sombre today.
At the end of the statement today, I thought, are you describing somewhere else right now? Because he was talking about record increases in support given to people. All it is to keep up with the double-digit inflation we're experiencing today. But let me say something about the health service, because you asked about additional money. Labour have said that if you close the non-dom tax loophole, that would raise £3.2 billion. And we would use that money to have the biggest expansion in the workforce in the NHS in a very long time, doubling the number of people that are going to medical school, increasing the number of people going into nursing training, midwifery training, health visitors, district nurses, a proper plan for the NHS workforce paid for by closing that loophole. So I've been clear that everything I announce, I'm going to say where the money is coming from. And that is just one different choice I would be making if I was Chancellor of the Exchequer.
What about income tax then? Because the government has taken arguably some pretty difficult decisions today on income tax. The ongoing freeze, this kind of ice age in what are known as the thresholds that people pay particular rates of income tax depending on how much they earn, which over time drags more people into paying a higher rate or paying something at all. And then that increase for the very best paid as well. Do you agree with all of that? What would you do about income tax? Because you want to be seen as a government in waiting. So what would you do?
It's a sign of failure, isn't it? I mean, the reason they are in
do?
this mess. Well, no, I think it is important to look at why we are in this situation. There is no other country that heading into a recession right now is increasing taxes on working people and cutting public spending. We are an outlier globally now.
So if you were Chancellor right now, what would you have done with the thresholds, and what would you have done with taxing the best paid? Would you have done something different?
Well, I started setting out some of the changes that Labour would make. For example, the bank surcharge today was reduced from 8% to 3%.
Yeah, but what about income tax? Because that's...
Well, I'm giving examples of different taxes that could be increased that would ease some of that pressure on ordinary working people. That would raise between £1 and £2 billion a year. We wouldn't have gone ahead with the cut in stamp duty. That would raise almost £2 billion a year. If you are a private equity manager and you are paying an effective tax rate lower than ordinary working people, we would close that loophole.
I take all those points, but I'm still interested about income tax because it's such a big thing for so many people. The government's decided to do some things today which are difficult from a Chancellor's perspective. And I just wonder, you want to be the Chancellor, what would you have done?
Well, what I'm saying is we would ask those with the broadest shoulders to pay a bit more of tax.
Well, that's what they're doing, isn't it?
No, it's not what they're doing. They're not doing the non-doms. They're not doing a proper
I'm talking about income tax.
But what I'm saying is you could raise money in a different way.
Right.
Raise money by taxing those with the broadest shoulders rather than just coming to those on average earnings who are seeing taxes go up.
Is it that you don't know what you would do about income tax, or you don't want to tell us?
Well, look, the next general election is probably not going to be for 2 years. So I'm not going to set out a manifesto for the next general election now because we may have 4 or 8 more fiscal statements.
Sure, and that's fair enough. But
I've given you an
wonder
example.
What your instinct is on income tax.
Well, my instinct is that working people should not be faced with higher and higher taxes because those with the broadest shoulders should pay more into the system. Those are the different choices that an incoming Labour government would make.
So the
and
very
different
highest
choices
earners might pay even more under Labour.
If you're a non-dom, you should be paying your taxes
Talking
here
about income tax.
in Britain. But Chris, the point is that you could raise taxes in different ways. It doesn't all have to be through income tax. You could tax the banks more. You could tax the private equity bosses more. You could tax the non-doms more. You could tax the big energy giants more. And if you do that, you don't have to keep coming to ordinary working people and putting all of the burden on them. That is what the Chancellor did today.
You famously were a chess champion. Do you think you could totally thrash Jeremy Hunt at chess? Or do you think he's quite canny?
I don't know what he's like at chess, but I'd fancy my chances.
I think
you'd probably be
I think
him.
having seen you play chess on Radio 2 a few months ago when you were on the Jeremy Vine show.
How'd you watch somebody play chess on the radio?
Well, because
he was in the studio.
Because I was going on next. It was a novel item, but it was very, very much in keeping with the Jeremy Vine's kind of approach to stuff. Chess on the radio. Why not?
Why not?
And given your pedigree as a school champion and all of that, I mean, as I say, I have no idea about Jeremy Hunt's chess pedigree, but I'd put my money on you beating him, I reckon, at chess.
Well, certainly playing chess has encouraged me to look a few moves ahead, and the next election may be a way off, but I hope today you just get an idea about the strategy going into the next election, fairer choices in tax and a proper plan.
You might have noticed this while all this autumn statement stuff was happening in Parliament. There was a big announcement outside Parliament, which is that Neighbours is coming back, having briefly been cancelled. Are you a Neighbours fan? Does that news excite you?
Well, you might have heard in my response to the autumn statement today that I'm a bit of a Dallas fan. With my reference to Bobby Ewing and old characters turning up and plots that unravel. And my mum texted me after the autumn statement today, obviously to say, oh, what a great job you did. And I said, I just want to say, Mum, thanks for letting me to stay up to watch Dallas. And she said, I am a good mum, aren't I? I said, you absolutely are. So it was those years in the 80s staying up to watch Dallas that gave me one of my lines in my speech
You and me
today.
both.
This is the thing with politicians, though. We ask a question about Neighbours and we get an answer about Dallas.
But what about income tax?
I remember Scott and Charlene getting married.
What's your Dallas equivalent now? As in like a show you watch now that you love? Or do you not have time?
I don't have that much time for watching telly at the moment. My favourite... Well, actually, let's come back to chess then. The Queen's Gambit. I did really enjoy the Queen's Gambit. Chess wasn't quite as glamorous when I was playing it in the 80s and 90s, but I did enjoy watching a strong woman beat the men at chess. That was great.
Well, thanks for coming in. I know you've got 9 million other interviews to do, so I'll let you go and do them. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.
Okay, let's delve into even more detail now with our next guests. We have got maths genius and maths teacher Bobby Seagull. Hello.
Hello.
And presenter of Money Box Live. That's Money Space Box, as we've just been discovering. Adam Shaw. Hello.
Hello.
Bobby, were you teaching your pupils about the autumn statement today? Because it was happening in real time.
Yes, I may have been in period 5 and 6 at the end of the day. We were having a lesson actually on currency conversion. So I thought, it's a good opportunity to explain what can impact the value of GBP sterling.
Okay.
So my students, year 8, they were getting quite engaged. At first, they were like, I thought the eyes were like glazing over.
Yeah, your lessons sound full on.
Yeah, it was. It was quite an important one.
How did you make it compelling to them then?
I think I told them about the value of the money in their pocket. I said, Christmas is coming up. You want to buy, your Xboxes, PlayStations, whatever you want to buy. Actually, what the Chancellor says impacts that, especially if they're being imported from the US and US dollar. They need to be, wary of values.
One of the surprises today was more money for schools in the next couple of years. What do you think about that?
So I would be very curmudgeonly to say, more money for schools, bad thing. Of course, it's a good thing. I think it's 2.3 billion extra over the next 2 years. But the sort of bigger picture is from 2010 to 2020, there was, in terms of spending per pupil in England, I think a 9% cut in real terms. So, of course, I am grateful, and I hope that this government continues to acknowledge how important education is, because that is the real big leveler. So hopefully it's just the start, because we've got 10 years of catching up to do, I think.
Adam, I'm so impressed with your binder that you've
sorry.
got there. No, I'm
That's
so
my cheat sheet, you see.
I love a good binder. So this is so.
We can talk binders.
I mean,
afterwards.
same name, same passions.
Yeah.
What's the most interesting?
What's in my binder?
Exactly. No,
it's a new slot. What's in Adam's binder?
Sorry, that's already been done. To death, some might say. No, but just give me some interesting things you spotted that maybe the rest of us haven't quite clocked in the hurly-burly.
Right. Well, I mean, there's obviously been a huge amount of coverage. So in a sense, you can find that everywhere. I think one of the interesting things was the Chancellor is sort of playing a trick. I don't mean that sort of disparagingly, but there is a trick to what he's doing in that it's one speech, 2 messages for 2 very distinct audiences. So I think at the very top, he talks about just what was getting cut. And then if you listen to the rest of it, it sounds like he's splurging money everywhere. So that's the political part of this. And then almost in a Shakespearean aside, he goes, yeah, but listen, markets, to the market, I'm cutting like crazy. Oh, and then to everyone else, no, there's loads of money. And of course, both are true in a sense. So that's interesting that he does that, and important. But I think also stepping back from this, from the hurly-burly of today's announcements, if you just look at government spending, nominal government spending, it's going crazy. It's really, really high. And although we're seeing big cuts today, this takes us back 3 years to what governments were spending 2 or 3 years ago. So this is still big government. And I think apart from what we're seeing today, it links into some very large questions about what we want from government. And I think those started in COVID, when you sort of, in the 70s, it was Keynesian economics. It was spend, Keynes was Santa Claus, and then sort of, Keynesian economics became like Scrooge. No, that's not the way of doing it. And monetarism became the new orthodoxy. So much, we don't even talk about it. It's just the way it's done. And then suddenly COVID came along, and you saw maybe there is a role for big intervention, big spending. And that might have marked a change. And I think what's really interesting, and what will be interesting, is our appetite, our as a nation, the public's appetite to say, what do we want from government? A sort of existential question. And are we prepared to pay for it?
Then that's the kind of big picture, isn't it, in terms of the state of the economy and how people react, as you say, to whether they want big or smaller government. Couple of things just to ask you about, Adam. One is recession, the R word used by the Chancellor today. The other, living standards, that suggestion that the fall in living standards greater than at any point since the 1950s. And it just struck me that whatever else we take away from all of these bits of paper and booklets and ring binders, that kind of just shapes the political conversation for the next 2 years, because that's what people are thinking.
Because the actual stat, isn't it, from the Office of Budget Responsibility, is that household disposable income, so how much money people have to spend, will fall by 7% over the next 2 years. And that has hardly ever happened, if at all.
I sort of object to the word recession, because actually there's a technical definition of 2 quarters of negative growth or contraction, right? But it's just arbitrary. I mean, if you talk to people, it's like a line. Oh, I'm not in recession. Now I stepped over this line. I'm now in recession. why I object to it is because it doesn't reflect the experiences of ordinary people. People don't wake up tomorrow and go, oh, I feel terrible, we're in recession. Recession is more like an upward hill that
Those
you are
who lose
walking.
their jobs between now and whenever might think that.
Well, yes, but you may lose your job, but that's not because there's a switch that goes. The way we as journalists talk about it, and politicians and indeed economists talk about it, is like there's a switch. You're not in recession and you are in recession. And why I object to that is because I don't think it actually reflects the lived experiences of anybody. It doesn't really work like that. So you may lose your job, but that's the top of this very steep hill you've got to. And I think it's much more interesting, important and relevant to talk about the steepness of that hill, whether you are in recession or not.
Bobby?
Yeah, I was going to add to that. So, like mathematically, if you think of recession as a normal distribution, so in the middle part is, that is the economy is shrinking. But if you look at the people in the bottom 10, 20%, they're being impacted much more by, again, the cost of living crisis. Again, today, one of the measures was the freeze in the threshold allowance. And I was thinking, actually, I'm a fan of RuPaul's Drag Race, and I think the Chancellor's new name will be Fiscal Drag, because at 12,500 he's frozen that threshold at the basic rate for the next couple of years, and that's going to impact a lot of my students and a lot of my families that I teach. So for them,
They'll suddenly be paying income tax.
Exactly, yeah. So you can bandy the word recession or no recession, but actually, whatever the reality is, it's going to impact them much more than people in the middle.
And actually, somebody who'd never consider themselves a 40p ratepayer might, in the next couple of years, suddenly become one, but at the same time go, but I don't feel like a wealthy person who should be paying this 40p rate, because that's the reality of fiscal drag.
I mean, there was some interesting data done by the British Attitude Survey. I think it's called a sort of regular thing. And although that's not particularly fresh, it did show a much more increased appetite for paying for stuff through taxes if we felt it was being well spent.
That's
this
a big
is all
if,
going to
isn't
play
it?
out.
Right,
yes,
yeah.
no. But I mean, this is much more your area, but this will play out politically, obviously, in the next few years. But I think these are big things.
And actually, I think it's so much about the economy is about expectations and expectations management. Because if I'm outside, saying, oh, I'm expecting it's going to be a cold day, I'm going to wear my scarf and hat, it's not going to change the weather. I can get my umbrella, I can start doing a sun dance. But with the economy, if we're overly pessimistic or overly optimistic, actually that feeds into our spending and saving habits. So actually what we say, our words really have power.
And that's the fascinating thing, isn't it? Because this is where the numbers collide with or interact with sentiment. That sense of either what you've expected versus what's happening, or the reality versus what you want.
And so much of these tax rises are, the freezing of the threshold, so things you're sort of not meant to even really notice, and quite a lot of them are quite a long way in the future. And then you look at them in the overall context of all the financial decisions made today, and actually the tax raising things seem quite small compared to all the attention that we give them in the news.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was some debate before, I was going to call it the budget, the autumn statement, I should say, that actually the markets wouldn't want it all to happen today, and that they just sort of make some announcements. But I think the markets reacted fairly well to this, and this is, I mean, it's always, when I was doing the budget, used to do the budget programme, it was a nightmare programme to do, because the Chancellor would, fire off 1,000 numbers, and I was desperately writing them down, thinking, I'm about to report this. I just may have.
And that was Gordon
down.
Brown, who was famous for firing them off very quickly and very gruffly.
Quick. And I'd go, what was the debt? And I'd call Evan Davis and go, did you get that? I'm not entirely sure. I'm about to say this.
That was pre-WhatsApp.
Yes, it was pre-WhatsApp. It was the telephone.
Right, Adam and Bobby, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for listening to us. Subscribe to Newscast on BBC Sounds so you don't miss an episode. The next one is going to be a preview of the World Cup, where we'll find out what it's really like for England and Wales fans. And we will launch
specialist subject.
And we will launch the BBC News World Cup sweepstake. Big names, big teams. What's going to happen? Bye.
Who are you backing?
All will be revealed in the next episode of Newscast, available on BBC Sounds.
Bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.